You know, on the eve of World War II, an entire generation of top military leaders just vanished. They were arrested, executed, and basically erased from history. For decades, the real story has been buried. But now, we've got new data-driven evidence, and we're reopening this cold case.
66%. Just let that number sink in for a second. In only 2 years, almost 2/3 of the Soviet Red Army's high command, we're talking its most experienced generals, were arrested. Now, this wasn't just, weeding out a few bad apples. This was a systematic demolition of the entire military leadership. And that, right there, leads to the huge question that has puzzled historians for ages. Why? Why would any leader, especially someone as calculating as Joseph Stalin, gut his own army right when war in Europe seemed inevitable? It just doesn't make sense.
Okay, so to find the answers, we have to go back. We need to understand the scene of the crime, the Soviet Union in the late 1930s, a period we now know as the Great Terror. This chart really shows you the sheer speed and brutality of it all. I mean, look at those massive peaks in 37 and 38. This wasn't a slow drip, it was a tidal wave of arrests. And the shaded parts of the bars, well, that's the grim part of the story. For most of these guys, an arrest wasn't a trial. It was a death sentence, either by a firing squad or from torture in some prison.
For a long time, the why behind all this madness was pretty much just speculation. But what if we could bring modern tools to this old mystery? What if we could use data to finally crack the code? And that's exactly what a team of researchers from the University of Chicago did. They basically became our historical detectives. They put together this massive new biographical data set, covering almost 2,000 of the Red Army's top-ranking officers. So by sifting through thousands of data points, everything from age and ethnicity to service records and trips abroad, they started looking for patterns. It's really the classic cold case approach, right? You build a detailed profile of the victims to figure out the perpetrator's motive.
So, what clues did all this data actually reveal? Well, as they dug through the files, a very clear picture started to emerge of exactly who Stalin was going after.
Okay, so the first clue they found is totally counterintuitive. You'd think Stalin would be targeting the old guard, older, more conservative generals, but the data shows the complete opposite. A 40-year-old officer had a staggering 66% chance of being repressed, but a 60-year-old, that risk drops all the way down to 38%. So in Stalin's army, being young wasn't an asset, it was basically a death sentence.
The next clue is ethnicity, and wow, the numbers here are absolutely chilling. So, an ethnic Russian officer already faced a pretty grim 53% chance of being purged. But if you were an ethnic Latvian, that probability just skyrockets to nearly 90%. And the data showed really similar high risks for Ukrainians, Jews, and other minority groups.
So when you start to put all these data points together, a very specific and pretty disturbing profile comes into focus. The ideal target was younger, from an ethnic minority, and held a higher rank. They were also more likely to have contacts abroad, maybe experience in the old Tsarist army, and a better military education. A pattern was definitely formed.
And this all leads us to the central twist in this whole investigation. Every single one of these risk factors points to one terrifying conclusion: competence. Stalin wasn't just randomly getting rid of his officers, he was systematically targeting his most capable, his most promising, and his most experienced leaders.
So that brings us to the motive. Was Stalin just paranoid, lashing out at shadows he thought he saw everywhere? Or was this something way more calculated? A preemptive strike against a threat that didn't even exist yet? The researchers tested two main theories. The first is an informed purge. That's where a leader thinks he's found a real plot, so he goes after the conspirators and everyone they know. The second is a preventive purge, which is a much more sinister idea. That's where you eliminate anyone who could possibly be a threat in the future, whether they're loyal to you today or not.
So on the left here, an informed purge looks like a cluster. You arrest one key guy, and then you arrest everybody connected to him. But on the right, a preventative purge is all spread out. You're not targeting connections, you're picking off individuals all over the network to make sure they can never connect in the first place. So which pattern do you think the real data from 1937 actually matches?
And yeah, the evidence is overwhelming. The data shows almost zero statistical link between an officer's arrest and the arrest of their direct commanders or the people under them. This was not a reaction to some hidden plot. It was a cold, methodical, and preventative campaign to chop the head off any potential future opposition before it could ever even think about forming.
Protecting your own power is one thing, but what happens when you've gotten rid of your best defenders right before the biggest fight of your life? Let's take a look at the absolutely devastating consequences.
Just 3 years later, in June of 1941, Hitler invaded, and the Red Army, now led by a new generation of officers who were inexperienced and promoted way too fast, just crumbled. The initial losses were some of the most disastrous in the entire history of modern warfare.
And this is where we see the ultimate tragic irony of it all. The very traits that made an officer a target for execution in 1938, being younger, more dynamic, more experienced, were the exact same traits that were desperately needed for promotion and victory once the war actually started. The men Stalin killed were the very men he needed to survive.
And this is really why this new research is so important. It takes us beyond stories and anecdotes and gives us the first systematic, data-driven proof that the Great Purge directly crippled the Soviet military, a decision that led to unimaginable suffering and cost millions of lives.
In the end, what the researchers found can be boiled down to one stark sentence. The Purge was focused on the most competent officers.
And it leaves us with one last, haunting question that echoes way beyond the 1930s. What is the ultimate cost when an authoritarian leader decides that their own absolute power is more important than their nation's actual strength?